U.S. is the largest consumer, producer, and exporter of corn in the world.
Well, if you're wondering why farmers are so concerned about their farm finances right now, they really just can't catch a break. It's not just because corn prices are below break even for most. It's the fact input prices are so high.
I never thought I was going to lose this much money this fast.
The Midwest is holding its breath. Acres of corn sway in the wind, but no engines rumble, no combines roll. Buyers have disappeared, prices have crashed, and shipments meant for China are stacked in limbo. Families who've worked the same soil for generations are watching their season slip through their fingers. Meanwhile, north of the border, Canada is moving fast, locking in deals with Japan, South Korea and Europe, turning global attention its way. American grain sits trapped in silos, while Canadian shipments sail toward new markets. How did this reversal happen so suddenly? Who pulled the strings in this global shift, and what does it mean for the future of US farming? Let's break it all down. Tariffs began to crush the value of American corn long before it could leave the docks. When the White House imposed steep fees on Chinese-built cargo vessels, the shockwave hit the country's agricultural core. Shipping costs through the Gulf of Mexico surged by nearly a quarter, lifting export expenses by hundreds of millions. Across the Pacific, container rates doubled within weeks, rising to $5,000 per unit and turning an already fragile post-pandemic market into a choke point for farmers. Yet transportation costs were only the first hit. By March 2025, a second burden arrived. The Federal Grain Inspection Service tightened its pesticide residue rules, raising testing fees by 40% and forcing every shipment to clear a new chemical threshold before it could move abroad. A load failed mid-route, it risked rejection and costly returns. Barge traffic on the Mississippi dropped well below the 5-year average and New Orleans became a floating warehouse. More than 180 vessels sat idle, waiting for inspections, paperwork and scarce empty containers. Corn darkened in the rain, while farmers watched revenue wither by the hour. Each week of delay shaved roughly 27 cents from every bushel. For growers across Iowa and Indiana, that loss added up faster than their operations could absorb. And as the logistical nightmare unfolded, international buyers began shifting their expectations. Global demand was no longer satisfied with grain that was merely abundant. It had to be clean, traceable and increasingly sustainable. The shock deepened in February when Mexico, one of America's closest buyers, banned imports of genetically modified corn. International feed mills quickly began adding similar clauses to their contracts. The shift caught US producers off guard, since over 90% of the nation's corn acreage is genetically modified. Practically overnight, American grain was erased from the list of preferred suppliers. Canada, however, had spent years preparing for this moment. Its Prairie Trace blockchain system could document every step from seed to port. The grain came with verification, low carbon, scores and a reputation for purity that matched the new global appetite. Within weeks, Canadian exporters secured long-term contracts with Japan, South Korea and the European Union. The deals were worth billions and the message to global markets was clear. The impact at home was brutal. Spot corn prices in the Midwest collapsed to $3.45 per bushel, the lowest in nearly a decade. Meanwhile, corn grown in Manitoba earned $4.20 per bushel, reflecting the premium placed on traceability and environmental compliance. Buyers were willing to pay more and they were no longer waiting for US producers to catch up. Cancellations rolled in. Contracts with Midwest cooperatives were terminated outright. Barges remained at anchor, silos overflowed, and buyers turned north without hesitation. America's role as the anchor of global grain trade began to erode before farmers' eyes. Canada's shipments checked every box that the modern market demanded, and trust had become a currency as valuable as the grain itself. The domino effect spread quickly. Corn stocks on US farms swelled to a 6-year high. By late September, the USDA projected that 2.5 billion bushels, roughly 68 million tons, would remain unsold. In Cedar Rapids, fall delivery corn traded at $3.74 per bushel, well below the break-even cost of production. Iowa growers were carrying average input costs of $165 per acre. Many decided to stop harvesting altogether, knowing the numbers could not work in their favor. Some listed their combines for sale, while others took night jobs to make mortgage payments. Indiana's rural economy began to falter under the weight of the downturn. In the first quarter of 2025, the state's economy contracted by over 6%. Food banks faced surging demand, and families who once supplied the nation's grain found themselves lining up for donated meals. The Food Bank of Indiana warned that over 130 million meals for low-income households were at risk of disappearing as funding and surplus grain programs dried up. Further west, Illinois ran into its own crisis. The Mississippi River's low water levels, now an almost annual problem, forced shippers to cut loads and shorten their tows for a third year in a row. Each ton of corn cost an extra $20 to move. Barges waited for weeks and the delay rippled across the supply chain. With storage maxed out and no profitable way to move the harvest, land investment firms began buying distressed farms at a fraction of their previous value. The ethanol industry, a key outlet for surplus corn, faltered under the pressure. Production in the Midwest dropped to under 88% of capacity. 25 plants were idled, sidelining more than 1 billion gallons of output. Valero's facility in Columbus, Nebraska slashed half its night shift, leaving more than 100 workers without jobs. Every lost buyer shrank the market further, and every idle plant rippled through surrounding communities. From the silos of Iowa to the port terminals in Illinois and the processing lines of Nebraska, the entire chain that once turned American corn into wealth was breaking down. Grain that had defined the nation's agricultural power was turning into a burden, weighing down the families and towns that had long depended on it. And through each step of the collapse, Canada built its edge with a clear and disciplined strategy. Every container that left Canadian ports reinforced the new reality. Grain travelled with proof of origin, chemical clarity and low carbon certification. This was more than a crop. It was a story buyers wanted to share with their customers, and that story translated directly into money. Old crop basis prices in Ontario rose as much as $1.87 above Chicago futures. Even new crop sales brought premiums of 18% or more. Buyers across Asia and Europe signalled they would pay for confidence. In March 2025, Canada and South Korea finalised an organic equivalency arrangement, allowing certified Canadian grain to bypass additional inspections once it reached Korean ports. Within weeks, Ontario cooperatives secured 5-year contracts. Saskatchewan followed with new supply agreements in Japan and the Netherlands, leveraging both the weak Canadian dollar and America's growing tariff problem. Canadian institutions added fuel to the shift. Export Development Canada offered insurance for single-lot shipments and reimbursed costs tied to low-emission transport. Rail routes were optimised to bring grain from the prairies to Vancouver efficiently, and some lines even picked up US cargo at discounted rates when returning from Asian markets. Meanwhile, the US Gulf saw an alarming decline. That same week, Canada celebrated its deal with Korea. The USDA logged a 14% year-over-year in vessel bookings from Gulf ports. Contracts shrank, ships waited empty, and the silence from global buyers became harder to ignore. Canada had not only taken sales, it had built a reputation as the source of premium, future-ready grain. That reputation rested on reliability and alignment with global priorities. Buyers wanted grain they could trace, promote and trust. American corn, despite its abundance, now faced skepticism. As the world shifted to low-carbon and transparent sourcing, the advantage belonged to the producer who moved first. Canada had claimed that spot while the US watched markets drift away. The consequences reach beyond corn. Soybeans are vulnerable next. More than 90% of US soybean acreage is genetically modified, and European buyers have already flagged that crop for exclusion from their low-carbon supplier list. The effects could cascade into dairy and beef, where feed preferences will reshape which producers can compete. Australia and Canada are already pledging net zero beef by 2030, aiming to capture market share before the US can adapt. Washington now faces a stark decision. One path involves reform, dismantling punitive tariffs, providing tools for green farming, implementing national traceability standards, and re-establishing credibility with international buyers. It would require political will and immediate action, but it could stabilise a collapsing sector. The other path keeps the current approach. Trade walls remain high, outdated inspections continue to slow movement, and subsidies struggle to cover the growing gap between cost and market price. Share your thoughts below, and we'll see you